morning. Thank you. I'm standing in for Dr. James Jackson, who couldn't be with us today. Dr. Basco is currently the Associate Director for Science Policy, Planning, and Analysis at the NIH Office of Research on Women's Health. Her research career spans both academia and government, so she's going to be able, in terms of career panel, be able to understand both what it's like to be on this side of the table and on the reviewer side of the table. She recently was the coordinator of the NIH Early Career Reviewer Panel and was involved in the Diversity Working Group Subcommittee on Peer Review that has been exploring reasons for racial disparities in NIH awards. I understand that part of the reason that she's here today is Dr. Jackson invited her after seeing her give a talk on sort of this understanding of how diversity was playing a role in NIH awards, and so she's going to be here to share that insight with us today. So thank you, Dr. Basco.
Thank you. Good morning. It's good to be here. What a beautiful classroom. When you said good morning, I thought it just took me back immediately to my lecturing days as a professor. I was thinking, I used to say that to try to get everybody to pay attention. So very happy to be here in this format. So just a little more detail on history. So I spent about almost 25 years in academia, moved over to the federal government about 5 years ago. So I am a Fed. I'm more a Fed now than I was 5 years ago. I think I've kind of learned how to be one, so I'll try to share that with you, and the decisions to make those transitions. But I want to tell you a bit about the work that I've been doing. While I've been at the NIH, I've been primarily at the Center for Scientific Review. So those of you who submit grant applications know that's the repository of all of your submissions and where they get sorted and then reviewed for potential funding. So I have that lens as a review officer. And then I spent a year at the White House and working in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So I took my NIH knowledge and interest to the science division of that office. And I had several responsibilities. I covered actually a pretty broad portfolio of neuroscience, and I covered mental health because I'm a clinical psychologist by training. But I also covered broadening participation in STEM and focused primarily in the career stage, because that's what I had been doing at the NIH, is trying to figure out how to help young folks become more successful in achieving grant funding. So I did that for a while and learned a lot about policy, and I thought this is really a good fit for me. As a psychologist, I can see where my skills actually applied to policy development. So when I went back to the NIH, I looked for an opportunity to do that, and that's how I just started 8 weeks ago at the Office of Research on Women's Health. I'll tell you a little bit about that and the policy work that we do there. So what I thought I would do is just kind of give you a sense of what we know now. I want to tell you that we don't have all the answers, but there's a lot of things in progress. I think the NIH is very much committed to figuring out how to be more equitable in its grant distribution. I think the fact that an entity like that with its history is self-exploring, is taking the time to figure out what they've done well and what they've not done well, and how they've handled gender diversity, racial, ethnic diversity, and other areas, I think is a huge plus. I think anytime a large institution looks inward, it's an accomplishment. I think what you can't see from your seat are all of the committees within the NIH that are really taking on the issue of workforce diversity in the biomedical workforce, and trying to understand how to help the people who work at the NIH, the scientists there, to be more successful, how to bring in more scientists from outside of the government into the government to be successful, how to help people stay with their work and advance within it. So there's quite a few activities, lots of work, and there's a very substantial core group of people, not just at the worker bee level, but at the leadership level, who are highly invested in strengthening the diversity of the workforce broadly and at NIH specifically. So I want to tell you a little bit about that. Now that was a surprise for me, I will tell you. There's lots of surprises in government, but as an academic, I was at University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas, and being on the grant applicant side, I mean, you generally think that the government doesn't really care, and that the decisions for funding are arbitrary, and when you don't get your funding, you get mad. And you blame everybody, and you think there's a bunch of idiots over there. But I will tell you now that and not just because I'm drinking the Kool-Aid, but because I mean, I'm impressed with just how committed people are, how hard they work, how hard they try to be fair and equitable. There's a lot of, as you know, a huge number of applications that come in every year, and lots of people involved with trying to help sort through them. So I've been impressed, and I probably drank a little bit of the Kool-Aid, but it's okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about bias in peer review and racial disparities in grant funding. So 2011, you're probably aware that there was an article that came out. It was actually from a study that was funded by the NIH to look at the connection between race and ethnicity and grant funding. And lo and behold, we found that there was substantial disparities primarily between black and white applicants. There were also disparities between Hispanic and white and Asian and white, but there were other logical explanations for them that did not, so they did not seem to be the best predictor of getting funding. So there were other issues, but race sort of remained for that black-white difference. The question then became, what exactly is going on here? What could be the explanation for it? And so they began to pose some hypotheses. And you know the concept of blame the victim. Those hypotheses sort of emerged, and then there was like, is it a bunch of does CSR just recruit a bunch of biased people to be their reviewers? Well, that's possible. Is there something unfair about the process? So they started to look at these things and formed a committee that focused specifically on peer review and trying to understand kind of what the problems are. So I was the executive secretary for that committee, which means that I executed the projects that this committee came up with there and was able to have some influence on their decisions about a framework for evaluating factors that could contribute to that racial disparity. These are folks from academia, primarily. My boss at the time, Richard Nakamura, is currently the director of CSR. We had a committee of 8 people and 3 co-chairs, which is always sort of fun to have that much. But brilliant folks, all highly committed and with different areas of expertise, some with bias expertise, some with stereotype threat expertise, some with decision-making expertise, some with group process expertise. So you're thinking about like what's happening in peer review from all angles that could be contributing to the process. So there are those who said, oh yeah, CSR, they systematically recruit people who are biased. It's kind of hard to do when you're recruiting 17,000 people a year to systematically pull out that group, but it's possible, right? So we need to know the answer to that. And then the other possibilities, there are other factors involved. So this is a blue ribbon group. They met for almost 2 years, actually maybe a little bit more than 2 years, guided the research, and then they were a subcommittee of a larger diversity working group. So the NIH has a permanent working group on diversity in the biomedical workforce. It is chaired by Hannah Valentine, who is our Chief Officer of Scientific Workforce Diversity. And so they're external folks, they're not internal NIHers, they're external folks who are trying to continue this work until we have clear answers and solutions. So when the subcommittee on peer review began to deliberate, they tried different ways of thinking about the nature of the problem, but they're all scientists, so they know there's probably lots of contributors. But the Ginther article, when it first came out, seemed to suggest there were 2 sets of hypotheses. There were either deficit hypotheses or bias hypotheses. And so there were lots of ideas and lots of opinions, but we thought it's best to try to get a feel for all contributions. And it also seemed that it would be easy to point to either the investigator or the reviewers, but there are lots of other things in play here. So it could be something at the institutions level that is a factor in those racial disparities. It could be something about the grant review process or the way that we process applications, the way we review them. It could be the reviewers, either what they think before they go to their study section meetings, so when they're on their own and they're reviewing applications, or it could be something that happens in the process of that meeting that biases in one direction or another. It could be something as simple as poor representation of diverse groups at those study section meetings. That could be part of it as well. So there's lots of things in play. I wanted to give you a sense of the things we were exploring. So with regard to deficit hypotheses, or things that were lacking, at the principal investigator level, the question was, is there a skill deficit? Is there a difficulty in writing grant applications? Is it a problem of not using resources to help prepare those applications? Is it a time management problem? Is it a waiting to the last minute problem? With regard to the institution, we knew that some institutions had a lot of resources and some do not. So that was a question. We didn't know if there were enough mentors in all places. Some people complained that they didn't have enough NIH R01 funded investigators within their institution, so there wasn't somebody who could help them in preparing those applications. So they had not as much funding experience as those institutions that had gotten a lot of grants. So was that part of the issue? Was it a deficit in the application? Like the instructions are amazing. I mean, I know you all have read through those, or not all of you, but those of you who've submitted applications. I mean, if you're a new person looking at this first time without a mentor, without anybody to give you guidance, it's just overwhelming. I mean, I could see where it'd be easy to give up before you started. And over time, those directions and instructions have gotten more complicated as more rules have been imposed. So is that part of it? Some people complained about the technical problems of submitting the actual grants.gov issues. When they decided to only allow one resubmission after the initial submission, there wasn't many chances to refine an application, so that could be part of it. Now the policy has changed to allow unlimited resubmissions. And then again, with the reviewers, is there something, are we not training our reviewers to be aware of bias? Are we not training the chairs of those committees to know when to speak up? If somebody says something inappropriate, are we not training our review officers, our SROs? Well, I mean, those are all the questions. Those seem like very reasonable things that could contribute, and that's what we've been exploring. Then there are the bias hypotheses. I mean, is there something about stereotype threat within the individual that might be a factor? Do investigators have low outcome expectancies, so they don't believe that they're going to get funded, and that affects the way they approach the task? Low self-efficacy for grant writing, could that be it? Could the institution be inequitable in how they disperse resources? So could it be that that there are certain people who get more support in preparing an application than others, and does that difference equate to or have a relationship to race or ethnicity? In the process, I mean, are we doing something biased in the way that we do outreach to institutions? We have these regional meetings, but are we reaching out maybe to the wrong schools or the wrong individuals, or focusing on the people who've had a history of funding and not focusing on those who are new to the game? Is there something biased in the way that we weight our scores? We do 5 criterion scores that map onto one overall impact score, but we weigh things like investigator and institution as much as we weigh the other scores overall, and is that a problem? And is there some, do we look at these things, do we look at the investigator differently if they're a young person versus a seasoned person? Do we look at an institution differently if they're well-funded versus not? So those are really good questions. Does that affect how the reviewer reviews an application and thinks about it? Is the structure, the way that we package an application together for review, is there something biased in the way that we do that process, because it's sort of arbitrary? And then we don't know if reviewer implicit bias is in fact present. I mean, maybe there is, and you know, maybe that has some influence on how they make their ratings and come up with overall scores. And then at the meeting, is there some kind of positive bias going on, like in favor of those who were well known, the good old boy system, the buddy system? Are we doing that? Or is there negative bias against people based on some particular factor, including their experience? So this is sort of the framework that led us to begin to explore, and we have some of these answered, and some of them we don't. So I just wanted to give you a sense of where we are, and there's work that's continuing to go, at least for the next 2 years. We've got projects ongoing. So the first thing we decided to do is ask the people who were most affected by funding, by not getting funding. And that was really new investigators for the most part, new and early stage investigators. What we knew is, because when you look at the black-white differences, we know the problem really is right from the get-go. Like, reviewers are making ratings, and then we only discuss at a meeting the top 50% of those applications, top 50% score-wise. And so black investigators weren't making it into the top 50%, so they weren't even getting discussed. So so that sort of eliminates the question of, is there a bias in the discussion process? Well, no, because the applications aren't there. So something's happening before that process and those initial scores. So that's one of the issues. We thought we'd ask investigators, like, what's going on? And what of these, and we thought we'd ask them about individual things, things about themselves, like how confident are you in pulling together a grant application? How much support do you have? Do people help you? Do you feel good about your ability to get funding and your ability to formulate hypotheses? How comfortable are you with putting together a research design, a research plan, and building a collaborative team to help you, et cetera? And are there things within your institution like resources and mentors, availability of materials, time, et cetera? And are there things at the review level that you've seen? Like, do you think review is unfair based on your reading of your summary statements that you get? What do you think, what's the deal? What do you think is there? And then we wanted to know if any of those things contributed to the racial disparity in R01 funding, to the big R01 grants. And this was based on self-report of funding in this particular thing. So we surveyed about 2,000 people. We oversampled for blacks to have enough in the sample. We had about 800 responses. A little less than half were female, and about half were white. So it was a very mixed sample. We were able to look at black-white differences, Asian, and we did a Hispanic, non-Hispanic analysis as well. Very interesting results, so depending on your point of view. And what was most interesting is what didn't seem to distinguish groups or contribute to that racial disparity. So there were no ethnic or racial differences in these variables. So access to training materials, time management skills, willingness to ask people to help, self-efficacy, so a belief in one's ability to produce a good application and to get it funded, how much contact people had with their NIH review officers or their program officers, use of grant writing resources, having mentors help them with their application, how much contact they had with their mentors around it. No race differences here, right? So these are a lot of the factors we were trying to get a sense of. There were some differences in a few factors. So if we looked at people who attended NIH grant workshops, like the regional workshops that occur, and we found that black respondents more often attended those than white or Asian respondents. When we looked at getting help from mentors, black and Asian respondents reported much more help from mentors than the white or multiracial group respondents. And then in terms of protected time, Asians had more protected time than any other group, and blacks had less protected time than any other group. So time carved out specifically to work on research and not having, getting a break on the teaching load. That's really critical. I will tell you as my own recollection, I was fortunate that my first job was in a mental health clinical research center where research is all we did. That's all we did. And had a funded position to do that, and it made all the difference. If you have time to think, it makes a big difference. There were also differences in a couple of other things. So we had them rate the statement, I believe that reviewers knew my race. And that was highest for Asians and blacks, more so than whites. You can sort of say, okay, that might make some sense. And I was confident I would receive funding was also highest for blacks and Asians, more so than whites. Which is interesting. That's not what I expected to find. We asked questions about the fairness of peer review. Do you think peer review is fair regardless of race or ethnicity, gender, institution? We actually had an individual item for each of those factors, and then we did a composite score. Blacks rated this lower than all other groups, the concept that peer review is fair. So that's reasonable because there have been lots of publicity around the unfairness of it. And Hispanics had lower ratings also of fairness than non-Hispanics. This is the only item out of a large survey where Hispanics and non-Hispanics were different. Otherwise, they were the same as other groups in the other items. So what does predict self-reported R01 funding? Well, race was really the only significant predictor. Perception that reviewers knew the race of the applicant did sort of come up as a possible predictor, but that was really mostly Asians who contributed to that score. So Asians saying that they knew my name, based on my name, they knew my race, ethnicity. There really were no other individual personal factors, no other institutional factors, and no other review factors that seemed to contribute. So, we've redone the Ginther analyses since 2011 when they were originally done, and they still show black-white differences. And these are great analyses that control for all the obvious factors like training and publication, institution, all kinds of things. And it's still an issue. Why is it? I don't know. We still don't really know. So here's some more clues. So we did a number, besides the survey, we've done a number of other things to try to get input from the universe, the scientific universe. So in addition to the survey, we did some focus groups. We did 7 focus groups that were quite interesting. 2 all-black focus groups, 2 all-Hispanic, 2 all-white, and 1 mixed-race focus group. We did, Dr. Nakamura did a blog post about our efforts, and we had a lot of responses that came in, a lot of opinions that came in. And then we did 2 America Competes contests. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second, but people basically submitted their ideas to try to help us identify ways to detect bias in peer review. So, but this provided a lot of responses to us. We wanted to know if there were any themes, were there any patterns here, were there things that seemed to make sense, that provided some insight into the problem with racial disparities. So we asked a couple of different questions on the survey, and then we didn't actually ask specific questions about the survey items in these other formats. We just had some general responses and then looked to see how they clustered. But on the survey, we asked what the most positive aspect of peer review was, and they said the things we hoped that people would say. They were helpful, their quality was high, they're fair, and they learn something from it. And that's really what reviewers want. They want people to learn something from it. So that's a good thing. That's generally a good thing. But then we asked, what's the most negative aspect of experiences in peer review? And those negative experiences popped up in about 47% of all the blog post responses we got. And of all the challenge submissions we got, about 70% of them also made notes about the negative side of peer review. The kinds of things they talked about: low quality, not enough expertise, the applications weren't read thoroughly, contradictory statements between reviewers. One says it's great, one says it's awful. I know, you're going to mumble as I get, sorry. The complaints about the comments coming in for the original submission were contrary to those in the resubmission. Even when the resubmission fixed the problems in the original, they found a different set of problems. There seemed to be unwritten rules in peer review. There seemed to be this sort of things that are not in the instructions that you would have no reason to know unless you were a reviewer. There seemed to be consistent complaints about positive bias towards well-funded institutions and well-funded investigators. That came up in all of the different venues we gathered the information from. And there was a lot of concern from the newer investigators that there was more of a focus on their status than their science. So being maybe discounted a bit because they were new to science. Now, when I looked at similarities and differences in just the focus group, so these are focus group discussions. Some of you have done those coding. I mean, the goal here is to generate hypotheses. This is not necessarily make policy from it. But there were some themes that were really interesting across. Remember, we had black, white, Hispanic, and mixed groups. Across the board, they're saying race is not the primary problem. They felt that the seniority issue was a problem, like being young and being perceived as too young, and lots of comments about, you need more preliminary data to support your hypotheses, or you need more publications to prove your worth, so there seemed to be a bias against the young. They also thought that just the financial issues, not enough money to go around, lots of other factors contribute. They did not, even when we asked specifically, and this is across focus groups, do you think race plays a role in how grants are reviewed and funded? And they consistently said, no, not really. I mean, we really couldn't get that, even from the survey we asked. We really could not get anybody to say, regardless of their race, that they thought that race played any role in the peer review process. Their complaints were really more so about the plight of the new and young investigator. The frustration with those resubmitted applications and getting a different set of critiques was huge. It kept popping up as a discussion. And also program officers. Some people thought program officers were really helpful, and some thought that they were inaccessible and awful. It was a lot of variability, which is a problem. So if you had a good one, you had a great one, you love them, they're wonderful, they make your life easier. And if you don't get the others don't respond to you, that's a problem, and those are the things that kept coming up. There were some noteworthy differences. Defense of the status quo, the white focus group members tended to note solutions to these things. They tended to say, yeah, we have this problem, they don't give us attention, so here's what we do to fix it. They offered more suggestions in that area. Grant writing resources seemed to vary. White focus groups had a lot of resources. Black focus groups members complained about not having enough. Hispanics brought up the issue of there needing to be more accountability for the ratings made by reviewers. the perspective was really different in the focus group. The white focus group members were really frustrated with being really close to the funding line and not quite getting it. And the others were really focused, the Black and Hispanic focus groups were really focused on not even getting discussed. So it's really two very different kinds of problems. So this is feedback that we're giving back to the NIH leadership that's helping them to sort of think about things. We did I mentioned before, we were solicited through the America Competes Act. We were able to do a contest. We gave an award. We gave $10,000 to the best idea for helping us to develop new methods to detect bias in peer review and strategies to strengthen fairness and impartiality in peer review. And the reason I bring this up is that we have just funded one of the awardees. We gave them a contract to flesh out their idea. And what they're looking at is the relationship between those individual impact scores, individual criterion scores, and their overall impact scores. Like, how do they translate the 5 criteria to the overall impact score, and does that process differ by race? Are they combining those things differently? So it's we have some methodologists from the University of Washington looking at that, so it's actually quite helpful. So while we've been trying to figure out solutions, we have been implementing a few changes that we think would be helpful. One is the Early Career Reviewer Program. Where's Tanae Lewis? There she is. I'm going to probably ask you later on to say a few words about that because she participated in the program. I recruited her. Thank you very much. And she has 2 R01 awards. Yay. Okay, we'll talk about that later. So the program started late 2011 but by asking universities to send in names of people they think would be good reviewers. The goal was to have more people who were young, but the goal initially was also to have a more diverse group of reviewers, and this was one way to do it, bring in people who were young, teach them how to write grants, teach them through their experience. They become then funded investigators who could then become reviewers, permanent reviewers on these panels. So it was that was part of the general strategy. The good news and the bad news is the program's been very, very popular. The bad news is we don't have enough review slots to take them all in because we can only have 1 early career reviewer per panel. And that's primarily because there's the expectation of high expertise on these review panels, and you can't really justify having a number of less experienced reviewers. The people who end up in the early career reviewer program tend to be folks who already have a lab, they have collected some data, they started to publish their own work, they have become independent of their mentors, so they are kind of on their own. They don't have to have funding in order to become an early career reviewer, but they have to sort of have shown some desire to seek federal funding and have had certainly some experience in their own lab, and they're publishing, they're actively doing that kind of work. So that's what we bring in. This slide is about 6 months old, so we've got many more that have participated. We have about half are female, about 20% of the ones who serve on committees are members of underrepresented groups. We've got a lot of folks on the waiting list, so the biggest frustration is not getting on the panel, not getting a chance to serve quickly enough. That's a big problem. The way we're addressing it is that we have been limiting our program to the Center for Scientific Review study sections, and we are now reaching out to the institutes and centers that also run review study sections to try to provide opportunities on those panels for our early career reviewers. So it's either that or it was raise the bar in terms of what it takes to become an early career reviewer. We chose not to do that. We chose instead to try to find more spots. So we can only put 1 person on, and we're also expanding the types of study sections people can serve on. We were very picky in the beginning because we wanted just the best experience. So we wanted only face-to-face meetings, and we wanted only where R01s were being discussed. And we wanted it to be really kind of an opportunity for mentoring, so we wanted the reviewers to make sure they were in the right spirit for this. But now it's sort of expanded rapidly. Reviewers love the program. They like having junior folks. They like being able to do mentoring. So it's actually turned out to be a really interesting program. So, progress. I started to look at who's getting grants, who's not getting grants. We're tracking people over time. So we decided to start following this cohort of people who started in the 2012-01 council round, which is the meeting that meets in late October, and people who all the way through the end of the 2015-01 council, which is basically the end of November. We think about things in council rounds. I could explain that later if you want to know. But we looked at people who had funding. We took the people who had R01s before they served and kind of set them aside and looked at everybody else. The question was, Do people who served as early career reviewers do better in terms of getting their future grants awarded? What we did in that group is we tracked the people who didn't already have a grant. 445 had submitted R01 applications. About 32% of them received their first R01 award as of last March. Now, we're doing this every year, so we'll update them again. If they may have actually already updated it in my absence. And these are R01 equivalent awards. So the DP awards, the R01 awards, the U01 awards, the big ones. So if we look at racial differences, we looked at, this is early career reviewers who are from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups. There were 108 of them. The success rate was about 23% in getting an R01 after they served as an early career reviewer. This is all others, everybody else, and their success rate was 35%, which is pretty high. So this is the table of R01s for new investigators. So new investigators are defined as those who have not yet had their big award. Just to give you the bottom line, the average is about 13 to 14% for new investigators. So I'm going back a slide. So 23% for the underrepresented groups, 35 for the others, and about 13 or 14 overall. So this is just by benchmarking. It looks quite good. Now, because we are scientists and we're skeptical, we are redoing these analyses in a variety of ways to look at it differently to make sure that we're doing this properly and we keep getting the same numbers. So it looks like it's working. And so everybody wants to be on a panel, and we want everybody to be on a panel, but there's only a certain number of panels. So part of it is just kind of the logistics of it, and we're looking for better solutions in that. I said there were other programs going, other projects going to continue on for the next few years. This is the biggest one. This is the anonymization project. So we're trying to test the value of making applications anonymous. So what happens when you take out the investigator identification, and what happens when you take out the institutional information, which, by the way, is extremely hard to do. I mean, like, we started this first experiment by taking a grant application from the view that the reviewer sees and taking a black marker to it and just like marking out stuff like you see the FBI redacting files. We started like redacting this stuff. It is really challenging to do that. So we've awarded a contract to a group whose first job is to figure out how to make applications anonymous. We got to figure out a strategy exactly, and then they're supposed to anonymize 1,200 applications. So there's 400 applications from black investigators, 400 from white investigators matched on as many variables as possible to the black investigators, and then another 400 applications that are randomly selected from the pool of white investigators. All of them will be made anonymous. Reviewers will review either the original version or the anonymous version, and then we'll compare the scores. And we'll see if those differences between anonymous and original, if they're there, if it makes any difference, and then we'll look at those by race and also by gender to see if they make any difference. While the reviewers are evaluating these applications, we're going to ask them to guess the identity of the applicant. So we're going to there'll be a follow-up survey that says, can you guess this person's race, ethnicity, gender, institution, and then can you tell us if you know who they are? Because we don't know whether it is the race of the investigator or the perception of race of the investigator that might make a difference, right? Or the perception of their gender. So we want to gather that information. So this has just started last fall. It's supposed to be finished by the end of 2018. The hardest part of this project really is figuring out how to make things anonymous. Once we do that, the rest of it's sort of a machine. Okay. Another project is University of Wisconsin's doing, we funded them to do another kind of project that's very similar, where they are actually changing the names and the institutions of applications. So they're changing the race by changing the name, and they're changing the institution from a high to low research intensive university, or mix them up. And they're going to, so changing race, gender, and institution, and then they're going to send them back out for review. And then compare these. Now, all the applications themselves were written by white males, so they wanted some sort of standard to start with, and so that's who we fund most. So we started with white male applications and then switched out the identities. So we'll see what they will do. They're also going to be recording the discussions amongst reviewers, which is, we can't do that legally, but since it's a mock scenario, they're going to be able to set up mock study sections and record it and see if there's anything in the conversation that might suggest that bias is occurring. And so they'll do that as well. And they'll also take the summary statements that are developed or written for these applications and mine them for language that might suggest that there's bias in that. And then one more project I want to tell you about before I stop, and this is really looking at grammar and spelling. So one of those questions like, is the difference between black and white applicants, is it a skill level? And essentially they found that if you get copy editors to mark up grant applications, really look for spelling and grammar things, everybody makes grammar and spelling mistakes. On the average, about 4 per page. And almost all of them are commas. Because these are copy editors, right? They're obsessed with things like that. So misplaced, overuse, or misuse of commas is the most common mistake. If you look at race differences, the group that made the smallest number of grammatical and spelling errors were black applicants. Asians made the most. Whites were in between. So it's sort of an interesting, but that's part of the hypothesis. Is this a writing problem? No, it's not a writing problem. There's something else that's going on. So let me just tell you briefly where I am now, and then we'll take your questions. So I'm now at the Office of Research on Women's Health. Our theme is to putting science to work for the health of women. So we're focused on health issues related to women's health, just to give you a sense of what that is. We're sort of moving from the old school version of women's health as being reproductive health. It was, it was about your female organs, and that's what that's about. And really focusing on all aspects of women's health, all organs, head to toe, all body parts. Because you're not going to believe this, but men and women have different body parts from head to toe, not just the parts in between. So, this is true. So that's what we focus on. You probably are aware of this office because of our work on requiring sex as a biological variable to be considered in your applications. That's one of our newest initiatives. And the main thing is we're just trying to get people to look at sex differences. So a lot of researchers would control for sex differences. We actually want people to look at it and see, in fact, there are sex differences. And if they can't do that in their project, then we want them to have a good reason for it, like it doesn't make sense or the literature doesn't support it. And you don't have to analyze for sex differences. We just want people to be mindful that it's not okay, especially like in cell studies or animal studies, to have 8 male animals and 2 female and then say they're all the same. So it's kind of just to be mindful of that and moving in the direction of looking at sex as a biological variable. So that's all I got. I'm ready to take your questions. Bring them on. Thank you.
Dr. Basco, that's
sure.
A fantastic talk. I just had a few comments before I open it up for questions. Just as 2 days ago, I was reading an article in the Atlantic about Silicon Valley and its efforts to be more welcoming to women and racial ethnic minorities. And I think what was interesting is that this idea of sort of how do organizations change is this overarching theme. And in Silicon Valley, they're trying to make organizational change through apps, and in NIH, we're trying to make organizational change through science. And so I was really struck by the application of experimental designs, whether in terms of the blinding of peer review or the, changing names, audio recording. I was very impressed to hear about that. I'm also a graduate of the Early Career Reviewer program, and I do agree it was fantastic. And one of the things that I think is really important with this, and I do think even though there is this wait list, I think everyone should sign up, is that the SRO helps you with your review. And I don't mean in terms of, don't say this, but you send it, at least at a woman SRO, and I sent it to her, and then we get on the phone, and she's like, so I see what you're trying to say here. This is a better way to say that, and so it was, this is going to provide better feedback to the applicant than the way that you've originally. So it's not changing what I'm saying, but how I'm saying it. And that was really helpful for me as somebody who had never reviewed grants before. My one question, I guess, to lead off is that since I've never been a standing member of a study section. I don't know if everyone knows, but so when you're on study section, there are people who are permanently on that study section who serve for 3 to 5 year terms, I believe. And then there are ad hoc reviewers, and these are people who were brought in. They have expertise on a specific topic, or in my case, as an early career reviewer, I'm just like the one. I didn't realize I was the only one in the room. That was good to know. And so I'm wondering, is there any effort, or do you think there's value in looking at permanent members versus ad hoc members? And then a corollary to that is that
them in regard to what?
in terms of the elements of bias.
Okay.
And then my corollary to that is that I've sat on 2 study sections, one of which was a permanent study section, one of which was ad hoc put together to respond to an RFA. So everyone in the room was together for the first time, and there wasn't a culture around however the study section was going to be run, versus one where there was an established sort of relationship between some of the reviewers who had been there for many years. And so that's sort of my opening question.
A good question. That's a good question. Do you mind if I stand?
No, please. Yeah.
The answer is I have no idea. I mean, logically it makes sense. I mean, so we don't know if study sections develop cultures that have a racial or biased tinge to it. I think the way that it's set up is that reviewers, every year, 25% of them are rotating off and a new 25% are coming on. So even the permanent members are not permanent. They're there for, they can serve for 4 years and come 3 times a year, or for 6 years and come twice a year. And so when they're not, the ones that are on the 6-year term and only there twice, they're subbing them for somebody else in that 3rd meeting. So, you know, I don't know. I think I mean, I was a reviewer myself for like 10 years before I joined the NIH, and people who were study section permanent members become the ad hoc. The ad hocs become the permanent ones. And then there's a question of how many meetings do you go to as an ad hoc before you've been indoctrinated in the culture. I don't know the answer. It's a great question. I think we're in a position to be able to answer that with the anonymizing project, because they're gathering it. We are intentionally picking people off rosters, so they're going to be either ad hoc or permanent members. We'll know, and we'll see if that makes any difference. So I don't know that we'll have. I mean, it'll be interesting to find out. I don't know the answer.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's start with Mario.
Oh yeah, great presentation.
Thank you.
Question on what we talked about some yesterday with low success areas. Were you able to capture funding success by topical areas, and whether or not it was specific to minority groups, and what were some of the implications of that, or probability of funding?
So the probability of funding, does it relate to topic? Absolutely. Topic, because it has to be within the mission of that entity, of that institute or center, right, that you're applying to. The investigator initiated awards. You know, people could just send in their own ideas. That sort of culture has changed. We're looking at, you know, specific areas that we care about. You'll see more program announcements and RFAs out, really looking at things that are very specific. So, you know, you want to pitch something that's within the interest level of that particular institute. So I think that is definitely true. But there are other factors that really play a really big role. One is really, you know, how much preliminary work have you done to prepare your application? Can you justify your design? Can you justify your recruitment plan? Do you have some real hard evidence, either from your own data collection or from others, that what you're trying to do is feasible and things like that? Tanae?
Just to clarify, I guess I think I know what you're getting at. We talked a little bit about this yesterday morning. Can you comment on whether there's a difference, a racial disparity in basic science applications versus behavioral science applications?
Oh yes, there's not. There's not.
There's not.
No, so the racial disparity seems to not, no, they try to factor in, like, is it clinical, is it basic science?
Or is it disparities work?
Is disparities work, is it prevention work? And there does not seem to be a specific pattern in that regard. Yes.
Yeah, I think following up on this, so the issue for me is whether the subject area is a confounder here a little bit of the race difference in funding.
It doesn't seem to be, in terms of, if you look at some of the, like Ginther's article, it did not contribute. There seems to be the disparity is across topic.
Right, but I mean, the reason why, you know, underrepresented minority investigators are less likely to get funded sometimes, whether it's part of that is because of the types of areas in which they're submitting grants. Because
yes, I think that's probably true.
In my experience as an on-study section, and I chaired a study section for a while too, is that the type of discussion that goes on within the study section is often very different depending on the subject matter.
That's true.
Because you know, some areas that are more, and you know, as you know, the review, first of all, the opinion of the first reviewers can have a lot of weight.
It can.
And then all the study section votes later,
right,
anonymously, within the range, whatever. But when, you know, when the topic area is a highly technical area where the rest of the reviewers, if they're not in that area, they can't really comment or understand much of what's going on. And that often happens in,
right,
you know, some of the basic science stuff, and genetic. Some study sections have a mixture of stuff. The genetic, you know, And so no one comments, everybody goes with what the reviewer said, there's little discussion. And in contrast, in some of the more, social behavioral stuff, even people for whom that's not really their area of expertise feel that they can comment on it, because it seems like, yeah, sure, I can talk about this. I from my life, I know. I mean, so I say,
Not disagreeing.
that doesn't make sense. So then there's a different kind of data, and as it probably, I don't know if this has been studied, but my sense, the more you time, this is something that reviewers always talk about. The more you talk about a grant, the lower the score goes.
Right.
So the grants that go through quickly and nobody says much, usually, if the start off was high, it stays high.
So I'm not going to disagree with you, but I'm going to interrupt you.
Yes.
So two things. So the problem with the black-white disparities in grant funding were that the black applicants weren't even making it to discussion.
Yeah.
So while you're probably I understand that every study section is different and reviewers are different, and every chair is different in their skill level. So the really good chairs don't allow that personal experience nonsense to be a factor in it. The ones that are not as good don't interfere in that conversation. So there's great variability, so that's important. But the big black-white difference is they're not even getting to the table. So are there some topic areas that are more likely to get funded than others? We're looking into that. I mean, I think we're looking at what's on what portfolios. I mean, you can, I think because the reviewers are academics, right? So you can, whatever biases you see in the academic world are probably brought to the review process. But that's really one of the big questions: is there a relationship between what you are interested in, based on that where your race and ethnicity have driven you in terms of your interest area, and what people want to fund. So it's definitely under investigation.
Can I follow up with this and just sort of ask you, in terms of topic area, is that, I think a lot of the work, certainly the work that I think many people in this room do, it's not so much topic area, but the fact that it's interdisciplinary. I mean, I know I've had this experience where you might have a biologist and a sociologist and a psychologist on a grant, and then you think about what study section is that going to go to, and do I want to send it to the expertise for this niche biological measure I've got, or do I want to send it to the expertise for the social measures that I've got? Because those necessarily aren't the same
Correct.
group of people. And so
That's
I wonder,
correct.
I mean, to what degree is topic area kind of this kind of correlated with the interdisciplinary sort of nature of health disparities research?
I think it's probably related to that. I mean, I think you're asking a really important question, which is about the match between your application and your team and the review panel and their expertise and who they are. And that's a complaint that has come up, sort of mismatch. How did my application end up with that group? They did not seem to be the right people. Yeah. So the solution to that is really, there's a couple things you can do. One is go to the website. For every study section has a website that has a description of what they study and what they review. And they also have their rosters of who participates. Read up on these folks, figure out who they are, figure out the study section, not just by the topic, by who the people are. And then that's one thing you can do. The other thing you can do is call your review officer. So when your application if it gets assigned, or if you're, even before, like, you get a choice, you get to be able to say, here's where I want my application to go. Mm-hmm. And for the most part, review officers take your choices. And so unless there's a really good reason not to, and when they decide not to take your choice in study section, they're usually right to not do that because you've chosen poorly. But talk to the review officers before you submit and say, this is really where the emphasis is in this application. Is it better for your study section or somebody else's? And they will tell you. They want you to call. So make use of that resource. What else?
Yeah.
I actually received DOD funding some years ago, which was through an anonymized application process. Have you been in touch with how they do that and
yes.
what the results have been?
They've done it, and they feel that it has done really well for them. However, they don't collect race and ethnicity data on their applicants or gender. So they can't tell us if there's any disparity. But there's other places, like NSF did a small experiment on anonymizing. They didn't design it well, so the outcomes were sort of sketchy, I think, in terms of interpretability. They basically had a 2-page anonymous summary of an application versus a full application with all of the information in, and try to compare the two. And it's kind of apples and oranges, so they got different scores, but you don't know whether it's because there were 2 different formats or one was anonymous and not. So we're hoping to figure that out. But yeah, DOD has made that a matter of practice for them. Most other non-NIH, non-government review processes that have tested out anonymous applications have found that it levels the playing field. So we'll see if it is the same for us.
Is there?
In the latest part of your presentation was a discussion of NIH moving toward doing more sex differences. Does it mean that the interest of NIH would be less toward gender differences and moving that, the definition of sex versus gender, to more biological interest?
Good, very good. No, so moving, I don't think moving is the right way to think about it, because I don't know that we had a very specific sex difference policy in place. It's a new policy. And the reason it was introduced is because there had been inattention to sex differences. Let me answer your question. So we don't really collect information on gender. So that's not one of those variables that we can collect. So it's hard to do gender-based research. So we're not moving from one to the other, but the Office of Research on Women's Health takes gender differences extremely seriously, and it's one of those things that we're looking for a way to be able to get that process and get those factors investigated within other grants. So I think it'll happen because we're driven to do that. But I think it's a big accomplishment to even to be able to get scientists to think about the possibility that sex could be a biological factor that influences their outcomes. And rather than just controlling for sex, there might actually be something to it. So I'm hopeful, actually, quite hopeful.
Yeah, here.
I have a question to try to understand the issue with the Black applications not even being reviewed, and just to sort of piggyback on sort of the topic area. Do you think that one way to overcome this, and I don't know if you've been able to measure that at all, is whether or not the Black applicants talk to the program officers before submitting their applications?
Yes, we did ask. We asked in our survey, and they said, and they talked to them just as much as anybody else does. There was no difference in that.
Okay.
So, in terms of, are they good program officers versus not so great? I don't know the answer to that. But they do seem to reach out as often as white applicants do.
Okay, so because you would think that the priorities, of the topic area would be conveyed to the applicant.
To program,
well, yeah.
I would imagine so, yes. That's typical.
I was wondering, to stay on the issue of the not discussed, is there, I've heard that we're less likely to be discussed, meaning sort of African Americans, and then also that we're less likely to resubmit after a
That's
not
correct.
discussed.
That is correct.
But is there any data on if we do resubmit, if we are eventually sort of more or less likely or equally likely to get the grant funded?
So I can tell you overall, investigators, the chance of getting funded increased greatly with resubmission. There's a significant bunch. I don't know if it varies by race, but I know that overall, just the fact that you've resubmitted and taking your feedback seriously, even though feedbacks can vary, but taking it seriously and making your application stronger does increase your chance. So persistence does pay off.
Risa?
Yeah, I have a question about the survey that you based many of your conclusions here on. And you mentioned that it had a 40% response rate.
Mm-hmm.
What happened to the other 60%? What are the sort of the general characteristics of that 60% that's the same? Or
So I can't tell you exactly. I can't tell you with any definitive certainty of who the non-responders were.
So you don't have any sort of.
I'll tell you why we don't, because we did this through a contractor, and we were trying to be as protective of privacy as possible, because there was a huge amount of anxiety that somehow the CSR would find out who the respondents were one way or another. So we had to be really careful to have an outside contractor send out applications but not keep any information about their race, ethnicity. So the only information we have are those who chose to check the box that says their race and ethnicity. So that's why I can't tell you. I don't know the answer, because it was sort of a trade-off, like you can have that. But even though it was interesting, because even though we promised to not reveal any personal information, and we were I thought we were convincing about it, we had a lot of people just not report. They filled out the survey but did not report their race or ethnicity or gender. So.
Yeah, Risa.
So I'm also very proud of what you're doing.
Thank you.
To sort of figure this out. My question is, and I wondered if you looked at the match between the reviewer and the expertise needed for the application. So, and could you look at some sort of a nesting where each reviewer looks at and evaluates several evaluations? So you have multiple observations per reviewer. The first reviewer is most important for the discussion, and they're probably the lead expertise that the SRO chooses for each application. So, but if somehow that matches off systematically for topics that Black investigators are submitting for, that could account for some
it could.
of the
And so that's come up
coursework.
as an important thing to look at. And so we're starting with anonymous, non-anonymous first. And let's see if it's just, if identity at all of the person makes a difference. If we find that there's really no advantage to anonymizing, then we go to that level of looking at those individual pieces of data. So it's, the thing is, rating expertise is hard because they're only experts on these panels. And a lot of the review panels are very homogeneous, so everybody's a subject matter expert in a very related field. Some study sections are very heterogeneous because the applications are. So you end up with all kinds of folks. Those are the study sections I was on. Were very, very mixed. No randomization. No, we don't do randomization because you're trying to get the best expert on each of those applications as is possible without overburdening some reviewers more than others and by trying to be equitable. So
just building on that, and I'll go to is there any value in looking at the range of initial scores for, because it's the average.
You mean
the initial scores before the pre-discussion, the range of initial scores, because if if there was a 2, a 3, and a 7, that application may not be make it, but it may be either because of this mismatch. I mean, is there value?
So we're doing that through the anonymizing project. The reason we can't do it otherwise is we eliminate preliminary scores. They are in the system. The reviewer puts in their final score, and the other one disappears. So we purge scores of all reviewers, within a certain time frame after all the paperwork's processed, just to protect confidentiality, essentially, and not have that information there. But the anonymizing study should do that because we're intentionally taking applications and we're going to get preliminary scores and we're going to retain those as part of this experiment. So hopefully that will allow us to test that out.
But on some study sections, they do discuss applications that have a large range.
Yes, they do.
Between two of the reviewers,
yes.
So those can be the exceptions to a low scoring application.
Yes.
Right. It's discussed.
Typically, if there's one really high score, and regardless of the other two, they typically get discussed at the study section because it means somebody saw something in the merit. And it doesn't have to be the first reviewer; it can be any of the reviewers. So typically, and if you see that disparity, the review officer will bring it up for discussion. And also, in addition to that, if an application is in the lower 50%, but one of the reviewers believes it should get discussed anyway, then it is. If it's an important topic area, if it has merit, if there's something about it that or if the investigators seem like somebody you should really invest in, then it'll come up for discussion as well.
So I'm just curious, I know I saw Joan Reed's name on one of the slides for one of the panels, and I know she's done a lot of this really elegant network analysis work.
Yep.
And I'm just wondering, some of what she's talked about is that minority investigators are often not in the quote-unquote right networks.
Correct.
And to what extent, I know that plays a role during discussion. I imagine that plays a role even, during reviews.
I'm sure it does.
Right? Like, who's on your team? So even though you may be at a well-funded institution and maybe you have, maybe minority investigators don't have the right people on their teams, or they're not in the right networks. So this happens on search committee where it's sort of the same networks, or people just don't want to take risks.
Yep, I agree.
And so I'm just wondering, is there a way to look at that?
Well, I think she's done a really great job in looking at network analysis and who's in and who's out. I think the literature, not necessarily just coming out of NIH, but more broadly, would endorse the importance of being in the right networks. So if you as an investigator are not within a network of people who are highly funded, get in there. Really, sell yourself and your expertise. Or try to get supplements to somebody's grant that has a big R01. Try to get in there. Become partner with them. And that's the reality of her. Because I think we're seeing that pattern of networking is quite important. Certainly, the emphasis on the well-known and well-funded. We know that there are certain people, certain groups, or really it's institutions like your own here, that you get a lot of funding. There are certain institutions that get a lot of funding. There's a lot of expertise. So, so when they say, well, we're not sure about this application, but it came from the University of Michigan's group. We know they do really great work. Does that work to your advantage? That versus a university that's less well known. I think it's just logical, right? You go with, and I think you raised an important issue, which is trust. So I think we impress upon reviewers that they're stewards of the people's money. The people is all taxpayers' money. So you want to spend it on what's most likely to be successful. So what's most likely to be successful? Something there's some good preliminary data for it, there's some track record behind it, and there's somebody well known who's in charge who knows how to either do the science or is there as a backup to help you run your project. So, to help you so having experts that can give you advice, that's always a positive thing. So, again, it's the same kind of, it's being good stewards of the government's money and thinking about what's going to get you the answers that you need to get that will advance the health of the country.
And then for you. Sorry, I've clearly got some proprioception problems on this left side of my head.
I thought you were just biased.
Right-handed.
I was fascinated by the focus group data, and one of the things that you mentioned were the differences between how some people even looked at the reviewers. I'm sorry, not the reviewers, the program officers. And some thought they were great, and some thought they were terrible.
Yes.
And they've probably been on both ends of that spectrum.
Yes.
So, what steps, if any, have NIH taken to kind of level that playing field as far as?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. There's a huge amount of training that goes on for program officers, and there's a lot of refresher training. I mean, there's for review officers, for program officers, for grant officers. I mean, the amount, that's kind of impressive, actually. The amount of continuing ed is amazing. Does that mean you can make one program officer as efficient as the next? It's like human nature, right? Do some return phone calls faster than others? Yeah. I mean, I think there's going to be variability just like there is variability in any other profession. So I think you have to, I think the point is if you're not getting the attention you need, then you talk more loudly. What program officers really like is they like it, if you want to talk to them about your project, they really like it if you send a request, you email a request with a very brief 1 or 2 page summary of what you want to do and request to make an appointment with them to set up a time to talk about it. They don't respond well to cold calls. They don't respond well to just some general question in the email without enough background to let them know what you're talking about. So if you're getting a bunch of those emails, you may get a slower response than if you say, hey, I'm so-and-so, this is what I want to study, I have a very specific question about the design, here's my 2-page summary, I would like to set up a time to talk with you about this. And then in general, those program officers will review what you've sent them before the phone call. And then you can have a better conversation. So that would certainly encourage that, and program officers would encourage that process.
Well, what if it's already under review and you're trying to get in touch with your program officer and you're just not getting those return phone calls or emails?
While it's still under review, I think if somebody doesn't, you handle it the same way you would handle any other person not returning your phone call. Who do you call? You call their boss? Call their boss. Call another program officer. Call somebody you know at NIH to go nag them for you. I mean, you work your network. Yeah.
Okay. Two different.
They know you well. They can tell just by okay.
Well, I'll start off by saying I'm sure I participated in the survey, and that's why I was really surprised when the result around bias in reviewer comments didn't come up. But maybe I'm just an end of one. But
bias in reviewer comments. Well, in the summary statement, you mean?
Yeah, racial bias in summary statements that you get. So one of the
it came
issues.
Up. It did come up, but not much.
That's what I mean.
It came up. It didn't. It wasn't a very. It came up as a comment, but it just didn't come up on many places. So these are the big themes that were cut across and covered most of the discussion. Okay. So, but there were a variety of other things like that did come up, and so we've given that feedback to the administration as well.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. So one of the things that I suggested was looking at the summary statements.
Yes.
Because that's where you can really see where the bias is. And the reason I say that is I remember we submitted a grant and actually got a decent score, close to funding, but it wasn't the first reviewer, it wasn't the second reviewer, it was the third reviewer that had a clear bias. We were looking at birth outcomes, and we were starting at 18 and up. And it had a lot to do with the recruitment sites and opportunities and all of that. And one of the comments was African American families. don't know why you're not including African American teenagers, because most African Americans have children as teenagers. So, where is the science?
So let me tell you, so first of all, it's a problem. So let me tell you what we're doing about that. So number one, the Madison, Wisconsin group under Molly Carnes is going to do text analysis of the summary statements.
Oh, wonderful.
So that's part of her project. So we are, for that very reason. And those comments that have, the inappropriate comments are supposed to be caught by the review officer and tended to, and so when they don't, it's a problem with training on the review officers. So we have stepped up, the chiefs have stepped up oversight of the review officers to try to do a better job at screening those summary statements and making sure that there is better social skill and common sense in responding to summary statements. So there's a training process. So there have been some complaints in addition, like your own. There have been some other complaints. I don't think it's the majority, but there have been enough complaints that clearly it's the problem is at the level of, for it ending up in your summary statement, it's a review officer error.
Right, but you could also see it in the score.
Yeah, you can see it in the score as well.
Good scores from number one, good scores from number two, but number three scores you lower, which means the overall impact. Right,
so the hope is these projects, as we're doing them, will shed more light on that. The plan is, if we see systematic bias from certain reviewers and we can identify what it is, then we fix it.
Okay.
And we figure out what needs to be done, and it's more than just, everybody has to take a workshop on implicit bias. I mean, it's like serious solutions. So I think we've really invested a lot of time and energy and money and people power to try to figure out the problem, and I think the solutions are forthcoming. We just really need to know what it is. Like in the beginning, when the Ginther article came out and they wanted to address racial disparities, they brought together a blue ribbon panel who became this working group on diversity and biomedical careers. And one of their key recommendations is everybody should take the implicit associations test. Do you know the test?
Yes.
And that would solve it. And because a few people took that test and were like enlightened. I mean, they said, "Oh my God, I didn't realize I had a bias. I'm going to be more mindful as I'm reviewing applications to not let that bias play out." Now, if we were all like that as human beings, that would be cool. Like like a 4-minute experiment, and you're better. That'd be great. But it is part. So what we've started to do is train all of the scientific directors in every IC, every institute or center, on implicit bias. So they are taking the IAT, they are getting a lecture from the lead scientific director, the head of intramural research. So we are starting to train the NIH people. The next level would be, sort of at the very top, because our belief was the senior leadership had to believe there was a problem and had to buy into what the solutions were before we could go any further. And so Hannah Valentine, who's our Chief Officer of Scientific Workforce Diversity, convinced the NIH director to do implicit bias training in all across the senior leadership. And so that's where it has started. So yeah, I mean, it's what you're complaining about is being attended to, and hopefully Molly Carnes' study will also bring it to light in her review of the summary statements.
Okay, so the chairs of the panel should also.
They should, and so that's part of the plan. But that's part of the plan. But but again, we're not jumping to that because we don't have actual scientific evidence, and so the problem, the recommendation of the subcommittee on peer review, which included experts in implicit bias, they said be really cautious in how you roll out implicit bias training because you are implying that your reviewers are biased, and you could have a iatrogenic effect. And in fact, some of them who are experts, like Jack DeVideo at Yale, he doesn't even give that test to his students anymore because there was such a negative reaction, pushback from people. It created more division than it solved. So he was on our committee, and he said, be cautious in how you roll this out, and so that's what we're doing. We're going to be, whatever we're going to deliver as the set of interventions is going to be done in a good way. That's database.
For interventions is just take my review statements. I got a lot of them I can share with you.
So I don't disagree with you. I'm just thinking that if we showed that to somebody who had bias, they wouldn't know that it was a problem.
Right.
So there has to be some other education that occurs, and that's what we need to work on. But we need some data to support the focus of the problem that we can measure again and know whether the training worked. Because if we just can't roll out stuff just because it feels right. We have to do things on a daily basis.
And so then the opposite experience, I also had the opposite experience where I'm sitting on a panel and it's not even an application that I was reviewing. It's something, you had a first reviewer, second reviewer, third reviewer, and everybody's giving all of these glowing discussions, and it was a very good application, but the issue of feasibility was a problem. And people were moving ahead because they were well-known researchers. And clearly, it was not feasible to do what they were proposing to do in that period of time, and nobody said anything. So I made the comment outside of the review process because I was not one of the 3 reviewers, and then that changed the nature of the discussion. But if I hadn't said anything, that beautiful proposal would have been funded, but it wasn't feasible. But it happens again because of the well-known researchers.
That's true.
They get an advantage that people give them a pass on.
There's clearly a perception of that, so now we're collecting data to see if we can prove that.
Okay.
Here, and then Mahasan.
So I appreciate the attention to disparities in the review process, and I have just a couple of questions about the studies that are currently underway. So for the anonymization study, can you just say a little bit more about the black-white binary in that and why other racial minority groups are not included?
It's a financial decision, so there's not enough money to do a large enough sample to do all groups. We had to start with the highest priority, and that's where our results consistently are showing black-white differences and not black-Asian or black-Hispanic differences that are holding up. And so that's been the consistent pattern. That's the highest priority for the NIH right now. So that's the rationale behind that. I missed the second part of your question.
Yeah, great, thanks. So for the Wisconsin study, I appreciate the innovation of the model, but I question the generalizability of the findings.
I agree. So do we?
These are.
It's an experiment.
Yes, so these are all proposals written from the positionality of white men.
Right. So any one study is not going to give us the answer. It has to be a combination of things, which is why we're looking at all inputs. If the problem should show up across the board. There should be some themes that are similar, and so all these various experiments should give us the same kind of result. And that's really what we need, right? This is a new area, and it's a new area under study, and it is an experiment. It's also done in Wisconsin. So that's where they did previous work on having people evaluate summary statements and code them up for gender disparity, and they found some interesting findings, but they used only applications from University of Wisconsin faculty, and they are different, have a different race and ethnicity breakdown than other institutions. So generalizability was a question with that one as well. So we're not going to make decisions based on any one study, but on the evidence that we're gathering, looking at it from various perspectives.
Okay, so will there be future studies that consider proposals that are written around different topics that minority groups might?
Can't answer what future will be. I think we need to get the results of what we have so far. These studies that are out right now are extremely important. Then we will go back to the diversity working group, which is this is an extramural group, and say, here's what we found. What do you recommend we do next? There will probably be an RFI that will go out telling the universe of, again, here's what we found so far. What do you think we should do? So if you get a chance to give input when the time comes. But I think we need to see what this first set of experiments present before we go further.
I appreciate the attention to the kind of NIH factors, but I also want to think a little bit about the non-NIH factors, particularly the data that show that there's less protected time for blacks, and also thinking about this idea of the not resubmitting and whether any of the institutional factors from their host institutions are a factor, even in terms of the number of submissions. The more R1s you submit, the more likely you are to get one eventually, and whether or not there are issues around that. And then also, I know that NIH has policies where they don't intervene on institutional level politics. So for example, with career development awards, your institution is supposed to submit a letter saying that you're going to get that protected time. Many times it doesn't happen, and for people who I talk to, colleagues who are on Ks, there's no NIH support that we can receive in terms of intervening on behalf of your negotiations with your institution.
That's true.
So is there any discussion about the ways in which NIH could sort of do outreach or try to provide more support or framing around what
I mean, you're raising a really important question, and that division between institutions doing what institutions choose to do and what the federal government wants, it's a tension across all federal government plus outside entities. You should talk to your leadership about that, because I think it's an important question that you're raising, and it does vary by institution. But you should talk to some of your leadership about what is that tension and what is available for you. And if you need them to advocate for NIH doing more, then write a letter to the director and suggest it. I think what I've learned from my big 5 years in federal government is how much the public really does have an influence. So your votes count, but your input counts, your questions count, especially if it's coming from senior leadership. So, you know, you as one individual investigator making that point might not be as powerful as your department chair making that point. Or your department chair going to your senior leadership about what needs to be done, or even working within your department on things. So the federal government tries not to micromanage any more than it has to, so I don't think that we'll take a regulatory stance on this. We certainly can encourage, we can reward and encourage, and you know, what happens is the schools that treat their fellows well get a good reputation and people want to work there, so there's sort of, that's a plus for the institution, but we're really not in a place where we can micromanage it. It's just, not only would it be unwelcomed by institutions, it also is just too much. We couldn't possibly do a good job at it.
Is there going to be data collection and any sort of reports that highlight any of those features that?
Not that I'm aware of. Not that I'm aware of.
So like
no, I think program officers are very mindful of what happens within their program. So for example, I'm in the Office of Research on Women's Health. We have a program called the Birch Program, and we're trying to assure that scholars are trained. So it's a small program, and our review officers are talking to those individuals who are being trained as part of those programs. We've hired a group to do a program evaluation for us. So the individual program officers care, and they're the shepherds of those programs. So if you feel like you're not getting what you need, talk to a program officer about it. So there is a tension. It's just not like NIH-wide in the agency sense. And I would not imagine that they would go down that path. I think they'd get a lot of pushback from institutions. Yes?
Other questions? Yeah.
I have a question about the, contacting the program officer after the grant is scored. So if the grant is scored, it's below the pay line, but now with this hopping of grants for select pay to align with the institute priorities, I know colleagues who have grants have been hopped, and so they're not funded, even though they're under the pay line. What can you do, what can I do to talk to my program officer and offer her, my program officer is a little non-responsive, so I'm not sure whether, and she's a bigwig, I know this, so I'm not a bigwig. What can I do to offer her? Should I offer to write something for the council meeting that talks about the alignment of my grant with the institute's and the branch's priorities? Or
there's no rule that says you can't. So if there's no rule that says you can't, then do it. You don't need permission to send an appeal of what you think could be done differently or what you're willing to do to improve upon whatever the concerns might be in a review. You can do that.
There are no concerns in the review.
Okay. Great.
So
you're just in line with a lot of really good applications, basically. Is that what you're saying?
I'm afraid I'm going to be hopped. Yeah, but maybe it's just my,
the right thing to do is to persist in trying to reach your program officer. Okay. So that means, cold calling their phone line as well as sending emails. If you know your review officer can't talk to you, but you can email your review officer and have them forward the email to your program officer, so they'll see somebody else's name on the email. So you just use your networks, use the people you know, and try to get their attention, and don't give up on it. But you can send whatever you want.
Is the decision about the select pay versus the applications they choose not to fund? Where is that decision happening? Is it happening by the staff, by the council of external people?
Yeah, so the council makes recommendations to the director of each institute and center. And the program officers provide some basic information. So it's most of it, for the vast majority of things, it's based on the score. So but every institute has their own slightly different system of how they handle bringing people up from below the pay line. There's a lot of variability. A lot of the directors are mindful of cultivating talent. They really want to have younger folks get funded, so they're mindful of where are some good applications that could be brought up. They're mindful of things that need to be studied, that need to be added to their portfolio. So there's like movement for topical reasons, for investigator reasons, and it varies from one IC director to the other. Some institutes and centers just have a cutoff. That's it, score. That's it, no discussion. And some have flexibility. So I can't tell you. If you can get funded, you should get funded however you can get funded to do your project. That'd be great. And if you already have a good score, that's wonderful. And you should nag your program officer and, don't create worries for them, but, in terms of if it's just worry, if you're just having fear, that may not be the most useful thing to communicate, but it might be good to communicate your ideas for where you think your grant belongs and what you think should be done. There's no reason you can't communicate with them.
I mean, asking them if it's going to be funded, they won't,
They can't tell you that. They don't know that.
Guarantee, right?
Yeah.
So
they can't know that until council meets, and council makes a decision, and council ultimately makes a final recommendation to the director, and then the director has to make the decision.
But the productive conversation that happens with the program officer, I guess I'm not sure what to get out of that discussion.
Between yours,
yes.
Oh, just if there's something that you feel
so
needs to be communicated.
What they need. No,
or
something.
You can do that. You can do that. Here's what I would recommend. I would recommend that you talk to another investigator who's been in your shoes, that has experience, and get opinions from your colleagues, because I don't know your particular area or your institute, and it varies somewhat. So I would pursue your program officer, ask good questions, ask your colleagues, use your networks.
Okay.
Those are the things.
So we're gonna break.
I don't have the skill that Amanda has. Sorry.
Thank you. This is a really important thing that NIH is doing, so we really want to thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here. Appreciate it. And add one more thing. I am now in your network, and you have my email address in your packet. You may email me. Okay. If I don't know the answer, I'll redirect you.
Are your slides on your website, or are they?
They are not, and you can't distribute them.
You can't distribute them.
No. Special just for you. No, Amanda will delete them. I did bring a few postcards here I wanted to share with you from the Office of Research on Women's Health. One is on the Women of Color Network. For those who are interested, there's one on SABV and just some information about the office. So please pick those up and take them, so I don't have to take them back in my suitcase. Anyway, thank you all.
Thanks, Dr.